Hello, my name is Ben McGrady, and I'm here today to speak with you about regulation of digital marketing, particularly with a focus on regulation of alcohol marketing in the digital space. I lead the Public Health Law and Policies team in the Health Promotion Department here at WHO headquarters, working closely with colleagues on alcohol control issues, as well as regulation of other risk factors for non-communicable diseases. So we have some experience working on regulation of marketing of tobacco products, for example, foods and beverage marketing to children, as well as some experience with respect to breast milk substitutes. And today I'm going to be sharing with you a number of observations concerning regulation of digital marketing. Based upon the other presentations, I'm presenting here 6 challenges and then some of the pathways that can be pursued in order to address those challenges as a public health community as we attempt to address digital marketing in the alcohol space. The first overarching point is that addressing digital marketing should be part of a comprehensive approach to marketing of alcoholic beverages. The second point that I'll make is that we need to consider at the country level in each individual country a series of fragmented laws. And in many instances, this will encourage ministries of health with a limited scope of purpose, a limited number of issues that a Ministry of Health has within its domain to focus on the alcohol industry rather than digital marketing per se. The third point that I'll make is that disclosure by advertisers as well as by online platforms is really essential to monitoring and enforcement of any restrictions on digital marketing. The fourth point is that regulating retail is essential to addressing marketing of alcoholic beverages, and that's both in bricks and mortar stores as well as in a digital environment. Fifth, enforcement begins with the alcohol sector and with local supply chains. Often we find that in discussions about digital marketing, people turn very quickly to thinking about how enforcement can occur in the context of large online platforms or in the context of actors outside of a country's jurisdiction. But we forget that there is a local supply chain and a local actor in the alcohol industry. And often enforcement begins with that sector. And then finally, I think it's important to recognize that commercial elements of user-generated content, for example, content generated by influencers and others who are engaged in commercial activities online, can be restricted, they can be regulated, and there are increasing examples of that occurring around the world. So turning then to my first point, which is about fragmentation of laws at the national level. Each country is different, but each country has a number of different laws that are relevant to digital marketing of alcoholic beverages. I've mentioned here many of those primary pieces of legislation or primary laws that are relevant. Countries have laws governing advertising in general. Sometimes those advertising laws include sector-specific restrictions, such as restrictions on tobacco advertising or restrictions on advertising of alcoholic beverages. But often the advertising law is just a general law applicable to all forms of advertising. Countries also have laws governing data protection. So who can collect the public's data or a user's data, and what can be done with that data after it's been collected, as well as what permissions are required from users to collect and use that data. This is very important in the digital context, where, of course, the whole advertising market is dependent on user-generated data for purposes of targeting advertising and other forms of marketing. Countries have in place consumer protection laws that govern, again, protection of consumers in a general sense. So these are often broad laws that govern a range of issues, such as misleading advertising or misleading marketing, that govern the ways in which it's possible for companies to approach consumers, prohibited approaches, as well as, of course, terms of sale, returns, and all these things that as consumers we deal with in our day-to-day lives. But consumer protection laws, particularly those laws that govern misleading or deceptive parts of marketing, or that govern the targeting of people in situations where it's not appropriate, can also apply to alcohol marketing and alcohol marketing in the digital space. Countries also frequently have laws governing broadcasting, the most obvious being laws governing the licensing and use of broadcasting in the context of television and radio. Frequently today, broadcasting laws also govern broadcasting that's conducted over digital platforms, including over the internet. So the most obvious examples are streaming platforms where entertainment content is delivered digitally through internet-enabled devices. Today, many countries include those in the scope of their laws governing broadcasting. Similarly, countries have laws governing telecommunications. This is not just our telephone networks, but also internet service providers and others engaged in the telecommunications sector. Obviously, when we think of digital marketing and its history, one of the things that countries were very quick to regulate early on was spam mail. Often this is done under telecommunications laws as a restriction, not just on advertising, but as a restriction on the way in which we can engage over telecommunications platforms. Then also governments have laws governing information technology, or what's now, at least in the European context, being referred to as digital markets. And these laws can govern the ways in which large online platforms can do their business, as well as the ways in which a whole variety of different economic operators and individuals can use networks within a country for either commercial or non-commercial purposes. And then finally, we have sector-specific laws, like laws governing the alcohol sector, tobacco sector, as examples. And so you can see in this simplified diagram that there are a number of different points of entry for governments to address marketing in general and also digital marketing. In an ideal world where a government has a whole of government approach to addressing the marketing of a commodity, then each of these different areas of law would be coordinated so as to ensure that they can effectively be used for purposes of enforcing a restriction on marketing of alcoholic beverages. And in the digital space, that becomes increasingly important because each of these different laws has different agencies responsible for its enforcement and implementation, typically. And typically, each of these laws offers a variety of different remedies or enforcement mechanisms that can be used by government in order to ensure compliance with the law. So, for example, in the context of information technology or telecommunications laws, there might be laws that permit government to order the takedown of online content, to block content, or to take other steps in order to actually remove marketing that prohibits the law from the digital space. But if the alcohol law is not coordinated appropriately with the information technology law or the law that enables those remedies, then those remedies won't necessarily be available to governments. So in an ideal world, governments should have a whole of government approach to this, and an approach that sees any restriction on marketing of alcoholic beverages appropriately integrated into all of the varieties of law that are relevant, and that enable government to enforce the restriction. In practice, however, I think what we see in most jurisdictions is that alcohol is viewed as the domain of the Ministry of Health in some respects, and that restrictions on alcohol marketing are frequently left to the Ministry of Health to enforce using the remedies that might be available to it under any law governing alcohol that sits under the auspices of the ministry. And so at the national level, there is this issue of fragmentation, and in a best case scenario, the possibility of very broad efforts to enforce restrictions on marketing. In the worst case scenario, a very sector-specific law that is highly restricted in terms of government's ability to actually utilise all the different mechanisms at its disposal for purposes of enforcement. Another challenge that governments face is monitoring the market and transparency. In the context of traditional marketing, that is marketing that's not digital, such as marketing in periodicals or newspapers, television, billboards, in-store marketing, there's a traditional sort of system of inspection where government inspectors are mandated with and tasked to inspect businesses and ensure that marketing that violates the law is not being undertaken. On the other hand, in the context of digital marketing, what we know is that the vast majority of marketing is tailored to individual consumers, and it's ephemeral in the sense that it appears on screen for a brief period of time and then disappears. So there's typically no way for a government to actually be able to identify the marketing that any one individual is being exposed to. Now, in this context, I think it's fair to say that disclosure obligations are essential. Disclosure obligations are, in fact, one of the key rationales for any regulation. They're designed to address asymmetries of information between the state and economic operators that the state's responsible for regulating. So it's essential that disclosure obligations are put in place so that the state can effectively monitor the market for digital marketing and ensure some degree of transparency in terms of what marketing people are being exposed to. And here there's a question of where to place the obligations. We've recently seen the Digital Services Act in the European Union be passed. That approach, which is a EU-specific approach, requires large platforms to maintain a register of content on their sites that then is available for inspection by authorities. For many countries, though, trying to regulate large online platforms in that sense may not be politically achievable. And in that context, countries are perhaps better off placing obligations of disclosure on tobacco, not on tobacco companies, on alcoholic beverage manufacturers and distributors. I mentioned tobacco companies because we've seen in some countries that tobacco companies are in fact required by law to disclose any marketing expenditure and the marketing that they're undertaking. Similar provisions can be put in place with respect to the alcohol sector, and where requiring large online platforms to maintain such databases and disclose their activities is not politically possible, then it's worthwhile for governments to consider how they could place similar obligations directly upon the alcohol sector. We're also aware that in the digital space or digital spaces, there's a very substantial integration of retail and marketing. To some extent, this is also true in physical stores or bricks and mortar stores, in the sense that there's a substantial amount of in-store marketing that happens in physical stores. It's worth stating in this respect that there are two different types of interventions that governments put in place to address that marketing. So we have, first of all, availability interventions. For example, licensing laws, minimum age requirements, restrictions on the time that outlets can be open, restrictions on outlet density, restrictions on the sale of alcohol based upon certain categories. These all affect the retail environment and marketing in the retail environment. Then there are also marketing restrictions that are specific to the retail environment, such as restrictions on price promotions, point of sale advertising, product displays, samples, contests, and prizes. The challenge that governments now need to take up is implementing equivalent measures in digital spaces and adapting those measures to the digital environment. We've begun to see some governments doing this by licensing and regulating online stores in much the same way as they would retail stores. One of the challenges that many governments face in this respect is that regulating the online environment tends to be the domain of a national government, whereas stores is often, and the physical retail environment is often the domain of subnational governments. So there's a coherence challenge and a need for subnational governments to work closely with national governments on these issues, but this challenge can be overcome. There are examples in a number of different contexts of governments trying to and successfully developing equivalent restrictions on availability and on marketing in online stores as are found in physical stores. Another challenge that arises in the context of digital marketing is enforcement. How can government effectively enforce its laws against different businesses, particularly where those businesses are not present in a country and don't necessarily have any assets that the government might use for purposes of enforcing its law? You can see in the diagram on the slide, which is a diagram that originally comes from the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission, that the supply chain for alcohol marketing or for digital marketing in general is quite long. There are a number of different actors in the supply chain, and in principle, each one of those actors is responsible for complying with a law that restricts alcohol marketing. In practice, it's often very difficult for a government to enforce its law against each of these actors in the supply chain. So you can see in the graphic here that the graphic points to the bottle. And in this respect, it's very important to remember that ultimately it's the product that causes the harm. It's the product that poses the risk to health. And because of that, we're seeking to address the marketing of the product. Now, the alcohol sector has a local supply chain. Locally, countries have manufacturers and distributors that have assets in the jurisdiction, and those manufacturers and distributors are also responsible for the distribution of products in the jurisdiction. In addition to that, there are, of course, retailers and other businesses, such as delivery services, that have assets, including alcoholic beverages, available for distribution in the country. So in practice, for countries, the first point to start in enforcement of digital marketing restrictions is locally. The first point to start is in the alcohol sector. And without doubt, there'll still be some gaps, particularly where businesses are part of large multinationals with other parts of the businesses located abroad. But focusing initially on the alcohol sector at the national level is a way of overcoming the challenge of businesses not being located in a country's jurisdiction. And then the final point of the 6 points that I wanted to make is that user-generated content, for example, marketing that comes from influencers, it can be restricted and it can be regulated And increasingly, we're seeing governments develop rules that govern and regulate marketing by influencers online. We see these rules applying both to the influencers themselves, to large online platforms, and also to the advertisers. Keeping in mind here that the advertisers are frequently local alcohol businesses, manufacturers or distributors, for example, that, as I mentioned a moment ago, have a presence in a country's jurisdiction. We also often find for many influencers that influencers marketing a specific product are often also doing so for specific markets. Not all, but some are, and that government may, in that context, have reach over those influences simply because they're within that country's territory. As you see on the slide, in practice, gaps often remain. For example, for very high-profile foreign influencers, for platforms that are located abroad, and for advertisers that are conducting their advertising and marketing spend abroad, there will be gaps in the sense that it will be difficult for one country to capture all user-generated content that is prohibited marketing. In addition to that, there are limits in the sense that users, even where they are influencers, are entitled to the practice of free expression. They're allowed to express their opinions, and that's protected speech. This is typically speech that I'm referring to that's not commercial in character. Where speech is commercial in character, for example, where an influencer is being paid to undertake an activity or to market a product, then typically this type of speech is not protected in the same way or to such a degree as non-commercial expression. And typically the commercial speech or the commercial relationship between an advertiser and an influencer can be restricted and regulated. And one way in which governments are beginning to do this is by requiring advertisers, such as alcoholic beverage manufacturers or distributors, to ensure that any influencers that they're in a commercial relationship with are complying with the terms of any marketing restrictions that are present in the law. In this way, again, making the alcohol sector responsible in the first instance. So in summary, there are many challenges that governments face in addressing digital marketing. And certainly there are challenges beyond those that I've mentioned in this presentation. But just as a way of recap, as I said from the outset, restrictions on digital marketing should be part of a comprehensive approach. Restrictions on digital marketing make sense where governments are implementing equivalent restrictions on other forms of marketing. And so in one respect, given the low levels of implementation of restrictions on alcohol marketing in general, a starting point for many countries is to begin to think about what a comprehensive approach to alcohol marketing looks like, rather than being focused solely on one sector such as digital or another. The second point that I made was that in many instances, the fragmented laws will encourage a focus directly on the alcohol sector for health agencies. It's worth recognising, however, that if a whole of government approach can be used, that this is the best approach because it can enable a broader set of enforcement mechanisms that are found in other laws implemented and enforced by other parts of government. The third point that I mentioned was that disclosure is central to monitoring and enforcement. We need either large platforms or the alcohol sector to be disclosing marketing so that government can effectively monitor it and supervise it and ensure compliance with marketing restrictions. It's essential also, as a fourth point, to regulate the retail environment in digital spaces for alcoholic beverages and to adapt and transpose restrictions on availability and restrictions on in-store marketing to the digital environment. In most instances, as I've mentioned, enforcement begins with the alcohol sector and local supply chains. They are in individual countries' jurisdictions, and they are the easiest point at which to attach an enforcement activity. So some additional thought needs to be given by governments to how they can hold the alcohol sector accountable for advertising of a product which is ultimately causing the harm. And then finally, it's important to recognize that commercial elements of user-generated content, such as influencer marketing, can be regulated and are in fact increasingly being regulated by governments. There are naturally some limitations on this, including in the context of free speech, but it's important to recognize that these elements can be regulated. Thanks very much for your time. Appreciate it.